All Saints' Day is a day that is full of memory. It's a day for us to remember that we are not alone. My mom and dad are at the beach this month fishing. I think my mom is fishing some, maybe not much. My dad for sure is. For the entire month of November, they've got a place. My dad has a place with his two cousins, Uncle Joe's sons, and they just fish all month. The tradition started a long time ago when my granddaddy Turman was trying to look for something to keep his brother Joe occupied, because Uncle Joe was an alcoholic. And, with those things, it's good to have people around you, and it's good to have things to do. And so they decided on this fishing trip. So every spring and every fall, there was at least a 3-day trip to some coast, some beach on the coast of Carolina. And so pretty much all that happened for 3 days was fishing on the pier, or fishing on the surf, or fishing in a canal, or sleeping, which you didn't do much of if the fish were actually biting, or drinking a really good strong coffee in the pier cafe. I remember when I was a kid, when I was old enough to tag along on these trips, just remember my granddaddy sitting on one of those benches, that you sit on when you're fishing off the pier, and smoking his pipe, and just generally being quite happy. And my Uncle Joe, my granddaddy's brother, he would, by lunchtime, would have known everybody on the pier and could call them by name. He almost immediately would throw his line in the water and strike off to make a new friend, and you could hear him all the way down at the end of the pier laughing. And he was a jokester, and he would sneak up behind you, and he would flick your fishing line without you seeing it, so you'd think you'd have a bite, and of course you would react, and he would just laugh, and he would laugh. And Uncle Joe loved his coffee really strong, but also extremely hot, almost boiling. And so when we would be in the cafe at breakfast, he would joke with the waitress about his coffee, and he would just laugh, and he would laugh. A couple of years ago, my son Joey went down to Cherry Grove Beach to fish with Dad. And so Joey got to spend a whole day in the boat with his granddaddy. Calls him Papa. And we actually caught some really nice trout. It was just a good day that we remember well. I'm going down to fish on Friday. I hope to get there early enough on Thursday evening, maybe to fish with Dad off the dock in the canal. But all day Friday is just going to be in the boat with Dad and his cousin Randy, who actually owns the boat. Randy and Dewey are Uncle Joe's sons. And I know that sitting in this boat, someone's going to share a fishing story. And ultimately, there will be someone who says, "You remember when Uncle Joe? Man, he knew how to laugh." And the memory of him will make us laugh. And I know that he'll be in the boat with us. When Scott and I were talking about this service and all that is involved in All Saints' Day, he said something like, the people for whom these candles burn, they're no longer with us. They're not here anymore, but they're not gone. A part of them remains with us, and we're not alone. Our gospel story that Becky read, it's a dramatic demonstration of Jesus' power, his power over life and death. And it's kind of a long story, and we just read parts of it. The part where Mary meets Jesus after her brother Lazarus has died. Well, before Mary comes to Jesus, Martha actually hears about Jesus' coming, and she goes out to meet him. And she says to him, "Lord, if you had been here in time, my brother would not have died." And what happens then is this conversation between Martha and Jesus about death and resurrection. And Jesus points Martha to the future and says, "Your brother will rise again." And she knows this, and Jesus knows this. This is a Jewish tradition. As I was reading N.T. Wright's commentary on this story, the Jewish teaching about a future resurrection. And most of the Jews in Jesus' time believed this. They shared Isaiah's vision. And it's language that I think if those of us who grew up in the church were familiar with it. The vision of Isaiah 65 and 66, where there will be a new heaven and a new earth. It's God's whole new world. This new creation that's coming. And God's new world is actually like ours, only with its beauty and its power enhanced, and with its pain and its ugliness and its grief abolished. And so within that new world, they believed that all of God's people, from ancient times to the present, would be swept up in that, and that everyone would have a new body to share and to relish this new creation. And that's our faith. That's what we believe. Martha believed that. But her response, when you read that story, after Jesus says, Lazarus will rise again, her response to him is kind of flat. Like, yeah, I know that. It's kind of like, at the moment, it wasn't very comforting. I think maybe sometimes we find ourselves in that place, in our grief and in our pain. But I don't think she's prepared for Jesus' response, for what's happening really in this moment. Because with Jesus, the future has burst into the present. Like God's new creation, and with it resurrection, has come kind of from the end of time into the middle of time. N.T. Wright said this: Jesus has not just come from heaven to earth, he has come from God's future into the present, into the mess and muddle of the world we know. I am the resurrection and the life, he says. Resurrection isn't just a doctrine, it isn't just a future fact, it's a person. And here he is, standing in front of Martha, teasing her to make the huge jump of trust and hope. So when Mary came to where Jesus was, she saw him and she knelt at his feet and she was crying, she was weeping. She said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. This time there was no theological conversation about death and dying and resurrection, but John tells us that when Jesus saw her weeping in the crowd with her, that he was greatly disturbed and deeply moved, and that Jesus started crying. Imagine that. I found that this was important to me as I've lived with this story. I assume that it's important for you too. That Jesus is deeply moved and disturbed by our pain. That it matters. And so, maybe like Jesus was standing in front of Martha, when Jesus stands in front of us and says, I am resurrection and I am life, what happens is that Jesus reveals God's love for us. Something that needs to happen, something we need to know. And he consistently makes this promise. We see it in the New Testament stories, especially when he says to his disciples, and he says, I promise, I will be with you to the end of the age. On one occasion he said, I'm leaving you, and it disturbed them. And he's like, I'm leaving you, in a little while you will see me no longer, but I will not leave you alone. So in our story, Jesus says to the crowd, well, where have you laid him? Where have you laid Lazarus? And their response is, come and see. Come and see. And it takes us back to the very beginning of John's gospel. In John chapter 1, beginning with verse 35, is the story of some of John the Baptist's disciples who see Jesus coming, and they approach him and they ask him, where are you staying? I think it was kind of their way of saying, we're curious about you. We've heard lots of amazing things. We want to hang out with you. And Jesus' response to them is, come and see. And so they did. They followed him. And they spent the day with him. And they weren't the same. They were different men. They were transformed. And they came back from that encounter with Jesus telling the others, we found him. We found the one we've been waiting for. In our confirmation class every fall, we start with that story about these disciples asking about Jesus, curious about Jesus, which is what the confirmation class kind of is about. And helping us see that Jesus invites us to come and to see for ourselves. Be in the place where I am. Be in my presence. And ask your questions. Be curious about things. And our whole year is about accepting Jesus' invitation to come. So when we invite Jesus to come and see, we invite him into our grief, and we invite him into our pain, and we should invite him into our tomb as well. You know, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, and so there was a pretty nasty stench, or should have been. And so our stench might not be that strong, but I'm sure there's some aroma that's not very pleasing. When Jesus invites us to come and see, he invites us to that place where he is. And it's a place of light, and it's a place of love, and a place of hope, and resurrection glory. Now, we end our commitment series today. I think it's an appropriate way to end this season when we talk about the ways that we're committed, when we commit ourselves to be the church, that we make a commitment to be faithful in our prayers, and that we're committed to be present. We're committed to give generously and sacrificially, and we're committed to serve generously and sacrificially, and we make a commitment to be a witness. Today we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, those who have gone on and those who are in the pew next to us. I think the only way to be a witness is to witness something of the power of God in Jesus. Jesus has the power to unbind us, to remove the cloth from our eyes, and to set us free. And so we come to this communion table in just a few moments. We'll read the liturgy and rehearse the story once again. And know that this table is for all of us, and that it's God's invitation for us to come and to see again. Thanks be to God.